Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into a story that hits differently while we build in Minecraft. Sometimes you give everything you have to someone, your time, your energy, your heart, and they can't even remember the one day that's supposed to matter most. Big thanks to everyone who's been showing up, dropping comments, and supporting the channel. Seriously, I appreciate you. You're the reason these stories are worth telling. So, our narrator's 28, a hopeless romantic who's been with his girlfriend for 3 years, and he's the kind of guy who shows love. Weekly little surprises, thoughtful notes, weekend plans made just to make her smile. When her birthday hit, he took it to another level and made sure it was a night she'd never forget. The problem is, not everyone remembers things the same way. I had been with my girlfriend for 3 years at that point, and I genuinely thought we had something solid. I'm not the type to half commit to anything, especially relationships. I believed in putting in effort, making her feel valued, showing up consistently. So yeah, I was that guy who sent surprise flowers to her office every week, left handwritten notes in her bag when she wasn't looking, planned entire weekend getaways without her having to lift a finger. I wanted her to feel appreciated, to know she mattered, and honestly, I thought that's just what you do when you love someone. When her birthday rolled around, I went all out. I rented a rooftop venue with string lights and a view of the city skyline, invited every single one of her friends, coordinated with them for weeks to make sure everyone could be there. I hired a professional photographer because I knew she'd want those memories captured. The whole night was perfect. She cried happy tears, told me I was the most thoughtful person she'd ever met, posted about it nonstop for days. Her friends kept texting me afterwards saying I'd set the bar impossibly high. I didn't mind. Seeing her that happy made all the planning worth it. 2 months later, my birthday came around. I woke up that morning feeling quietly excited, not because I needed some grand celebration, but because after everything I'd done for her, I figured she'd at least acknowledge it. She kissed me good morning, same as always, got ready, and mentioned she was going to brunch with her sister. I said cool, have fun, assuming she had something planned for later. Maybe a surprise dinner, maybe just a quiet night with a cake and a card. I wasn't expecting a rooftop venue. I just wanted to feel remembered. Hours passed. I went about my day, kept myself busy, checked my phone more times than I'd like to admit. No text, no call. Noon came and went, then the afternoon. I started wondering if maybe she was planning something and just keeping it under wraps. Maybe her sister was helping her set something up. I tried to stay optimistic, but as the hours dragged on, that optimism started curdling into something else. Doubt, hurt, confusion. She came home at 8 in the evening, walked in, kicked off her shoes, started telling me about brunch, how her sister had ordered this amazing French toast, and how they'd walked around downtown afterwards. She was in a great mood, completely relaxed. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at her, waiting for the moment she'd remember, waiting for her face to change, for the realization to hit. Nothing. She poured herself a glass of wine, asked if I wanted to watch a show. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "Do you know what today is?" She paused mid-sip, looked at me with this confused expression, and pulled out her phone to check the date. I watched her face go pale. Her mouth opened slightly, and she whispered, "Oh my God." Then came the apology, rushed and fumbling. She said she was so sorry, that she'd been so stressed with work that it completely slipped her mind. No cake, no card, not even a text message. Nothing. I told her how much it hurt. I didn't yell, didn't try to guilt trip her, just explained calmly that after everything I did to make her feel special, it stung to realize my own birthday didn't even register on her radar. That's when things took a turn I wasn't expecting. Instead of apologizing again, instead of acknowledging how I felt, she got defensive. She said I was being dramatic, that birthdays aren't that important, that I was acting like a child for expecting some big gesture. I wasn't asking for a big gesture. I was asking to be remembered. Here's where it gets absurd. She started turning it around on me, saying I was guilt-tripping her, that she already apologized, and I was making her feel terrible for a simple mistake. A simple mistake, like forgetting your partner exists for an entire day, is just a minor oversight. I stood there, realizing this wasn't actually about the birthday anymore. This was about a pattern I'd been ignoring for months. I gave everything. She gave excuses. I started thinking back through our relationship with fresh eyes, and suddenly so many moments clicked into place. All those weekends I'd planned. She never planned one for us, not once. All those flowers and notes. I couldn't remember the last time she'd done something thoughtful just because. The emotional labor, the effort, the constant showing up, it had all been one-sided, and I'd been too caught up in being the perfect boyfriend to notice. Or maybe I had noticed, and I just convinced myself it didn't matter because love is supposed to be selfless, right? But there's a difference between selfless and being taken for granted. I spent the next few days in this weird headspace, going through the motions but mentally checked out. She acted like everything was fine, like we'd moved past it. But I hadn't moved past it. I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, I thought about sitting in that apartment alone all day, waiting for acknowledgement that never came. I thought about how quickly she'd dismiss my feelings, how easily she'd flip the script to make me the bad guy for being hurt. A week later, I told her we needed to talk. I'd spent those days thinking it through, making sure I wasn't just reacting emotionally, but the conclusion was the same every time. I couldn't be with someone who only valued effort when it was directed at them. I ended it, calmly, clearly, without drama. I told her I needed a partner who matched my energy, who saw relationships as a two-way street, and that I didn't think we were compatible in that way. You want to know what she said? She called me selfish, said I was keeping score, that relationships aren't transactional, that I was throwing away 3 years over one mistake. I almost laughed. One mistake, as if forgetting my entire existence for a day was just an isolated incident and not a symptom of a much bigger problem, as if the issue was the birthday itself and not the complete lack of reciprocity it represented. The irony of her calling me selfish wasn't lost on me. The guy who'd spent 3 years bending over backwards to make her feel loved, selfish for finally asking to feel valued in return. It was like watching someone gaslight themselves in real time. She genuinely couldn't see it. Or maybe she could, and admitting it would mean acknowledging she'd been coasting on my effort the whole time. I moved out 2 weeks later. She tried calling a few times, sent some long texts about how I was overreacting, how she'd make it up to me if I just gave her another chance. But here's the thing. I didn't want her to make it up to me. I didn't want to be with someone who needed a breakup to finally start trying. I wanted someone who showed up from the beginning, who didn't need a wake-up call to realize their partner deserved thoughtfulness too. Looking back now, I don't regret ending it. If anything, I regret not ending it sooner. I spent so long trying to be enough for both of us, trying to compensate for her lack of effort with even more effort on my part, thinking if I just loved her hard enough, she'd eventually meet me halfway. But that's not how it works. You can't love someone into being a better partner. They either want to show up or they don't, and she didn't. The worst part wasn't even the forgotten birthday. It was realizing that to her, my feelings were always going to be secondary, that me being hurt was somehow worse than her causing the hurt in the first place, that asking to be valued made me the villain in her version of the story. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to be the one to haul it to the curb. I chose the latter, and I've been better for it ever since. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Now, back to this train wreck. She still occasionally pops up on my social media, posting quotes about how she only wants real, genuine connections now. I have to bite my tongue every time. Real and genuine. That's rich coming from someone who couldn't even remember the day I was born. But I'm not bitter. Honestly, I'm grateful. That forgotten birthday was the alarm I needed to wake up and realize I deserve better than someone who only loved me when it was convenient. But wait until you hear what happened when someone's so-called emergency turned into a beach vacation. My boyfriend called me one night absolutely panicking. I could hear it in his voice immediately, that shaky, desperate tone that makes your stomach drop because you know something's genuinely wrong. He told me his car had completely broken down on the side of the highway, that the mechanic quoted him $1,200 for repairs, and without his car, he couldn't get to work. He was nearly in tears saying he didn't know what to do, that he was paycheck to paycheck and didn't have that kind of money lying around. He asked if there was any way I could help him out, just until his next paycheck, and he'd pay me back as soon as possible. I didn't even hesitate. We'd been together for almost 2 years at that point, And when someone you love is in genuine distress, you help them. That's what partners do. I had some savings set aside for emergencies, nothing massive but enough to cover it. I went to the bank that same night, withdrew the full $1,200, and transferred it to him immediately. He thanked me over and over, said I was saving his life, that he didn't know what he'd do without me. I told him not to worry about it, that we'd figure out the repayment later, and that the important thing was getting his car fixed so he could keep working. 2 days later, I was scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break when his story popped up, and there he was, on a plane, champagne glass in hand, big smile, airplane window behind him with clouds and blue sky. The location tag said Cancun. I stared at my phone like it had just grown a second screen. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I kept refreshing, thinking maybe it was an old photo he'd reposted or something. But no, the timestamp was from that morning, and the next story showed him and 3 of his buddies at a beach resort, drinks with little umbrellas, jet skis in the background, the whole paradise vacation setup. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. My hands were shaking as I opened our text thread and typed out a message asking what was going on. I kept it calm, didn't want to jump to conclusions even though my gut was screaming at me. I asked if that was really him in Cancun, if everything was okay with the car, just trying to give him a chance to explain. He read it immediately but didn't respond for over an hour. When he finally replied, it was the most casual thing in the world. Said, yeah, one of his friends had surprised him with a free trip last minute, and he didn't want to be rude by turning it down. I read that message 3 times. A free trip. Didn't want to be rude. I asked him about the car, about the $1,200 I'd sent him 2 days ago for the emergency repair he absolutely needed, or he'd lose his job. That's when the response took way longer to come through. I watched those 3 typing dots appear and disappear for a solid 5 minutes. Finally, he admitted he'd been using rideshare apps to get to work, and that the car repair could wait a little longer, that he'd still get it fixed, just not right this second. The audacity genuinely took my breath away. He'd called me in fake tears, spun this entire crisis about being stranded and desperate, drained my savings account, and then turned around and used my money to fund a vacation with his boys. I told him I wanted my money back immediately. He said he'd already spent most of it on the trip, on excursions and drinks and meals, that he'd pay me back eventually, but it might take a while. Then he had the nerve to get defensive, saying I was being controlling for tracking his social media, and that I was making him feel guilty for accepting a generous offer from a friend. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Controlling. For noticing he'd publicly posted his betrayal on the internet for everyone to see. For expecting honesty after handing over $1,200 based on a lie. I told him we were done, that I couldn't be with someone who'd manipulate me like that, who'd fake an emergency to steal from me. He tried to backtrack, said I was overreacting, that it wasn't stealing because he planned to pay me back. I blocked him mid-paragraph. I was done listening. But that wasn't even the worst part. I reached out to a couple of his friends, the ones I thought were decent people, and explained what happened. Showed them the screenshots of him begging for money, the timeline of events, everything. I figured they'd be as disgusted as I was. Instead, they took his side, said I was being bitter about the breakup, that he was allowed to have fun with his friends, that I was trying to control where he went and what he did with his time. They completely ignored the lying and the manipulation, twisted the whole situation into me being some jealous ex who couldn't handle him going on vacation. It was like living in an alternate reality where facts didn't matter. These people watched him scam me out of $1,200 and somehow decided I was the problem. One of them even told me I should be happy he had good friends who wanted to treat him to a nice trip. I wanted to scream. This wasn't about the vacation. It was about the lie, the betrayal, the complete lack of basic human decency. I spent the next week furious and sick to my stomach. Not just about the money, though that hurt badly since it was most of my emergency fund, but about the principle. He'd looked me in the eyes, metaphorically speaking, and lied with such conviction that I'd believed every word. And now he was walking around playing victim while I was out $1,200 and a boyfriend who turned out to be a con artist. Then came the breaking point. I was venting to my coworker about the whole mess, and she asked if I'd considered small claims court. At first, I thought that seemed extreme, but the more I sat with it, the more sense it made. I had all the evidence. The texts where he claimed it was an emergency car repair, the bank transfer, his own Instagram posts proving he'd lied. I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. I just wanted my money back. So I filed, filled out the paperwork, paid the filing fee, gathered every screenshot and receipt I had. When he got served, he blew up my phone with messages I didn't read, sent emails calling me petty and vindictive, saying I was ruining his life over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That's what we were calling fraud now, apparently. His friends reached out too, saying I was taking things too far, that he'd already apologized and I needed to let it go. Except he hadn't apologized. Not once, not genuinely. He'd only ever deflected and blamed me for being upset. Court day came and I showed up with a folder full of evidence. He showed up looking like he'd rolled out of bed. No preparation, just this attitude like the whole thing was beneath him. The judge asked him to explain his side. He stammered through some story about how it was a loan between partners and that relationships are built on trust, and I was being vindictive. The judge asked if he'd paid any of it back. He said no, but he intended to. Asked if he'd used the money for the stated purpose. He admitted he hadn't. The judge ruled in my favor in under 10 minutes, ordered him to pay back the full $1,200 plus court fees. He looked genuinely shocked, like he'd expected to charm his way out of consequences. I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Vindication. Not happiness exactly, but the satisfaction of knowing I hadn't let him get away with it, that there were still places where lying had actual repercussions. He still tells people I ruined his life, apparently. Mutual acquaintances have mentioned it to me, how he goes around painting himself as the victim of a crazy ex who sued him for no reason. He conveniently leaves out the part where he committed fraud. But honestly, I don't care what story he tells himself or anyone else. I got my money back. I learned a valuable lesson about trusting people's actions over their words, and I dodged a lifetime with someone who saw me as a resource to exploit, rather than a partner to respect. The whole thing taught me that some people will rewrite history to avoid accountability, and their friends will help them do it. But facts don't care about the narrative, and sometimes the best thing you can do is let the system handle it instead of trying to convince people who've already chosen their side. I got justice, he got consequences, and I moved on to better things. Speaking of people who twist the narrative, let me tell you about the coworker who got me fired for doing them a favor. I was working retail at the time, one of those big box stores where the pay was barely above minimum wage and the drama was somehow always at maximum capacity. I'd been there about 8 months, doing my thing, showing up on time, keeping my head down. There was this coworker, Jake, who'd been there maybe a year longer than me. We weren't friends exactly, but we were friendly enough. Said hi in the break room, complained about customers together, the usual coworker stuff. One afternoon, he came up to me looking genuinely distressed. Said he had a family emergency and desperately needed someone to cover his closing shift that night. He was practically begging, saying his mum was in the hospital and he had to get there as soon as possible. I felt terrible for him. I'd already worked the morning shift, but I told him, yeah, of course. Go be with your family. He thanked me like I'd just saved his life, said he owed me big time. We went to the computer together, put the shift swap into the system officially, got it approved by the assistant manager on duty. Everything was documented and legitimate, so I worked a double, stayed through the evening, handled the closing procedures, locked up the store, went home exhausted. I didn't think anything of it. I'd helped someone out during a crisis. That's what decent people do. I went to bed that night feeling pretty good about myself, honestly. Like I'd done something kind without expecting anything in return. The next morning, my manager called me before my shift and asked me to come in early for a meeting. The tone of her voice made my stomach drop immediately. When I got there, she had this expression on her face, disappointed and stern, like I'd personally let her down. She told me to sit down and then explained that Jake had filed a formal complaint against me. I literally laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. According to Jake's written statement, I had forced him to leave his shift early, taken over his position without proper authorization, and then abandoned the store entirely, leaving it unattended for the last 2 hours before closing. I sat there with my mouth open, waiting for the punchline that never came. I told her that was completely insane, that we'd done an official shift swap, that I'd worked the entire closing shift and she could check the security footage she said she already had. Here's where it gets absurd. The security footage showed me there the entire time, exactly like I said. You could see me at the register, restocking shelves, doing all the closing tasks, locking the doors at the end of the night. But apparently that didn't matter because Jake had been there longer and had never had any complaints before. He was the more established employee. His word carried more weight. She showed me his written complaint where he claimed I'd been hostile toward him for weeks, that I'd aggressively insisted on taking his shift as some kind of power play, and that multiple people had witnessed me leaving the store early. I pulled up the text messages on my phone right there, showed her him begging me to cover, me agreeing, him thanking me, showed her the shift swap confirmation in the system with the timestamp and the assistant manager's approval. I was expecting her to realize immediately that Jake was lying. Instead, she looked at the evidence, nodded slowly, and said that while the swap might have been approved, the fact remained that Jake had filed a formal complaint about my conduct and that created a hostile work environment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The guy lied about a family emergency, manipulated me into working a double shift, then reported me for the exact shift he'd begged me to cover, and somehow I was the one creating hostility. I asked if she was going to review the complaint against the security footage and the digital records. She said she already had, and while there were inconsistencies, the real issue was the workplace conflict I'd created by accepting his shift under unclear circumstances. That's when I realized this wasn't about truth. This was about politics. Jake had been there longer. He had relationships with management. I was newer, more expendable. She told me they were letting me go effective immediately for creating workplace conflict and violating company protocol. I asked what protocol I'd violated. She said accepting a shift swap without properly documenting the reasons. Except we had documented it. We'd literally used the company system. None of it made sense, and that was the point. They'd already decided. I cleaned out my locker in complete shock, walked to my car feeling like I'd just been gaslit by an entire corporation. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I'd done someone a favor and lost my job because of it. And Jake? Jake was still there, probably laughing about it in the break room. But that wasn't even the worst part. 2 months later, I heard through a former co-worker that Jake had been promoted to shift supervisor. The guy who'd falsely accused someone of abandoning their post was now in charge of managing others. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. I thought about reaching out to corporate, but what was the point? They'd already shown me how much they valued evidence over politics. Then I remembered Glassdoor exists. So I sat down one night and wrote out the entire story, every detail, the fake family emergency, the shift swap with documentation, the security footage proving I was there, the firing despite evidence, Jake's promotion. I didn't exaggerate anything. Didn't have to. The truth was damning enough on its own. I posted it and honestly didn't expect much to come of it. Just wanted it documented somewhere that this company treated people like garbage. Things went from bad to unhinged. Apparently my review got flagged by corporate HR because it mentioned specific incidents and names. They launched an internal investigation, pulled the security footage again, reviewed the shift swap records, interviewed the assistant manager who'd approved it, talked to other employees about Jake's history. Turned out I wasn't the first person he'd thrown under the bus. He had a whole pattern of manipulating newer employees and then reporting them when things didn't go his way. But he'd never been caught before because nobody had documented it as thoroughly as I had. 3 weeks after my Glassdoor post went live, I got a call from corporate HR. They apologized profusely, said there had been a severe mishandling of my case, and that Jake had been terminated for falsifying reports and creating a hostile work environment. The exact things they'd accused me of. They offered me my job back with back pay for the time I'd been gone, plus a promotion to the position Jake had briefly held. I almost laughed. They really thought I'd come crawling back after they'd shown me exactly how little integrity they had. I told them thanks, but no thanks, that I'd found better employment elsewhere that actually valued honesty, which was partially true. I'd picked up some freelance work and was doing fine, but mostly I just didn't want to work for people who'd believe a liar over documented evidence until it became a PR problem. The HR person sounded genuinely surprised that I declined. Like they'd expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to return to the place that had humiliated and discarded me. They asked if there was anything they could do to change my mind. I said no, that the damage was done and that maybe they should focus on fixing their management training so this didn't happen to the next person. They thanked me for my feedback in that corporate monotone voice, And that was that. I heard later through the same former coworker that my old manager had been demoted after the investigation revealed she'd ignored clear evidence to protect her favorite employee. Apparently, several other people came forward with similar stories once they realized corporate was actually listening. The whole store got audited and restructured, all because I decided to write an honest review instead of just swallowing the injustice and moving on. The whole experience taught me something valuable, though. Sometimes helping people backfires spectacularly through no fault of your own. Sometimes the system protects the wrong people until it can't anymore. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just refusing to let liars control the narrative. Jake got fired, I got vindication, and I never had to set foot in that store again. You think that's bad? Wait until you hear about the person whose entire wedding got cancelled after they'd already paid for everything. I was engaged for 2 years to someone I genuinely thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. We met through mutual friends, dated for 3 years before he proposed, and everything seemed like it was falling into place. When we started planning the wedding, he was upfront about his finances. He told me he was bad with money, always had been, that budgeting stressed him out, and he'd rather I handle the logistics. I didn't love that arrangement, but I figured we were building a life together, and someone had to take the lead on planning. So I did. I paid the venue deposit, $5,000 to lock in this beautiful garden space we'd both fallen in love with. Then came the catering deposit, another $4,000. The photographer required half up front, $3,500. Flowers, another $2,000. Invitations, DJ, cake, it all added up fast. Every time I brought up splitting costs, he'd promise his work bonus was coming through soon and he'd pay me back for everything. Just handle it for now, he'd say, and we'll settle up later. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? We were about to get married. $18,000. That's what I'd put down in total by the time we were 3 weeks out from the wedding. My savings account was nearly empty, but I kept telling myself it was an investment in our future, that once we were married and combining finances, it wouldn't matter who paid what. I was excited despite the financial stress. Everything was coming together. The RSVPs were in, my dress was altered and ready. We'd finalized the seating chart, and then he asked if we could talk. He sat me down in our living room with this serious expression that immediately made my chest tight. I thought maybe someone had died. Instead, he told me he wasn't ready for marriage. That he'd been doing a lot of thinking and realized he needed to find himself before he could commit to forever. He needed time, he said, space to figure out who he was outside of this relationship. I sat there completely numb, trying to process what was happening. 3 weeks before our wedding, after 2 years of planning, after I'd poured my entire savings into deposits, he was calling it off. I was devastated. I cried for days, barely left the apartment, couldn't eat or sleep. My friends rallied around me, helped me start the process of cancelling vendors and notifying guests. It was humiliating and heartbreaking in equal measure. And then, about a week into this nightmare, I got a text from his sister. She'd been one of my bridesmaids, someone I'd gotten close to over the years. The text was clearly meant for someone else. It was a screenshot of a flight confirmation and hotel booking, a 3-week solo trip to Europe. Departure date was 2 days after what was supposed to be our wedding. My hands started shaking as I read it. She realized her mistake immediately, sent a flurry of apology texts, but the damage was done. I'd seen it. He hadn't been planning to find himself. He'd been planning a vacation. I felt sick. I called him immediately, demanded to know if it was true. He tried to play it off at first, said his sister had the dates wrong, but I pressed and eventually he crumbled. Admitted he'd booked the trip months ago, that he'd been having doubts for a while but didn't say anything because he didn't want to waste the deposits we'd already put down. Let that sink in for a second. He'd strung me along for months. Let me keep paying for a wedding he knew wasn't going to happen because he didn't want to waste money. Not his money, my money. The money I'd drained my savings to provide because he'd promised to pay me back. And here's where it gets absurd. When I asked why he'd book a European vacation if he was supposedly so broke he couldn't contribute to our wedding, he got defensive, said the trip was something he needed, that it was a chance for growth and self-discovery, and that I wouldn't understand because I'd never prioritized my own needs. I demanded my money back, $18,000, every cent I'd put toward a wedding that was never going to happen, because he'd been too cowardly to be honest with me. He actually laughed, said it was our shared investment in a future we'd planned together, and that just because things didn't work out didn't mean he owed me anything. Our shared investment. I'd paid for everything while he'd saved up for a solo vacation to Europe. The mental gymnastics required to frame that as shared was honestly impressive in the worst possible way. I started calling every vendor we'd booked, explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. Some were sympathetic, others less so, but I managed to get partial refunds on about half of what I'd spent. The venue gave me back $2,000 because they were able to rebook the date. The photographer refunded $1,000. The caterer kept everything because it was within their cancellation window. All told, I got maybe $7,000 back, still down $11,000 for a wedding that never happened. That's when I decided to take him to court. I consulted with a lawyer who told me I had a solid case. I had bank statements showing every payment, text messages where he'd promised to pay me back, emails discussing the wedding expenses. I filed in small claims for the maximum amount I could, knowing I'd probably never see all of it, but determined to get something. When he got served, he called me furious, said I was being vindictive, that I couldn't handle the breakup like an adult, that suing your ex-fiancé was psychotic behavior. His family got involved too. His mother called me crying, begging me to drop it, saying I was tearing their family apart and embarrassing them. His sister, the one who'd accidentally exposed his trip, stopped talking to me entirely. They all acted like I was the villain for wanting my money back after being lied to and used. It was like living in an alternate dimension where accountability didn't exist. Court day came and I showed up with a binder full of evidence. Transaction records, screenshots, vendor contracts, everything organized and highlighted. He showed up with an attitude and no documentation. The judge asked him to explain why he felt he didn't owe me anything. He gave this rambling speech about how relationships are about give and take, how we'd both benefited from the planning process, how I'd made the choice to pay and he'd never forced me. The judge asked if he'd promised to pay me back. He admitted he had, asked if he'd paid back any amount. He said no. The judge ruled in my favor for the full amount I'd requested, plus court costs. I could see him physically deflate in his chair. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something shift. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of closure I desperately needed. I'd stood up for myself, refused to let him get away with using me, and the system had actually worked in my favor for once. Things went from bad to unhinged when, 8 months later, I saw the announcement on social media. He was married, to someone he'd apparently started dating 3 months after our breakup. The timeline made my stomach turn. The wedding photos showed this elaborate destination ceremony, clearly expensive, and there he was in the captions talking about finally finding his person and being ready to commit. Ready to commit. The same man who told me he needed to find himself before he could marry anyone. I showed the photos to a friend who just stared at her phone and said, "You've got to be kidding me." Because that's all you can really say at that point. The man who'd claimed he was too emotionally immature for marriage had managed to meet someone, date them, propose, and get married in less than a year, which meant either he'd been lying about needing to find himself, or he'd found himself remarkably quickly in Europe and come back ready to commit to someone who wasn't me. I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting. Not because I wanted him back, I absolutely didn't, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. It wasn't about being ready for marriage, it was about not being ready to marry me specifically. And rather than being honest, rather than having a difficult conversation months or even years earlier, he'd let me plan and pay for an entire wedding he had no intention of going through with. The cruelty of it still catches me off guard sometimes, but here's what I learned. Some people will take everything you offer and still find a way to make you the villain when you ask for basic fairness in return. They'll let you drain your savings, break your heart, and waste months of your life, and then act shocked when you demand accountability. And their families and friends will back them up, because it's easier than admitting someone they love is capable of that kind of deception. I got my money back through the legal system. I got out of a relationship with someone who saw me as a resource rather than a partner. And yeah, it hurt like hell and took me a long time to trust anyone again, but I'm genuinely better off. Last I heard, he's still telling people I was bitter about the breakup and sued him out of spite. I don't bother correcting the narrative anymore. People who know me know the truth, and people who believe his version weren't going to be on my side anyway. And if you thought fake wedding plans were rough, imagine finding out your family's emergency was just a credit card scam. I got a call from my aunt one evening and immediately knew something was wrong. She was sobbing, barely able to get words out between gasps for air. My stomach dropped. Family emergencies hit different when you hear that kind of panic in someone's voice. She finally managed to tell me that my cousin, her son, was in the hospital. He needed emergency surgery, something about complications from an accident. The details were fuzzy through her crying, but the main point was clear. Their insurance wasn't going to cover it. They needed $5,000 or the hospital wouldn't proceed with the surgery he desperately needed. She asked if there was any way I could put it on my credit card, just temporarily, and they'd pay me back within 2 weeks when some payment came through. She promised they were good for it, that this was life or death, that she wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely critical. I didn't even think twice. This was family. My cousin. Someone I'd grown up with, spent holidays with, someone I cared about. If he needed surgery and I had the ability to help, the decision was already made. I told her yes immediately, asked her to send me the hospital billing information so I could call and arrange payment. She said she'd handle it on her end, that it would be easier if I just sent the money directly to her account and she'd pay the hospital. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too focused on helping to question the logistics. I transferred $5,000 that same night. She thanked me through tears, said I was saving his life, that she'd never forget this. I told her not to worry about it, that family takes care of family, and to just focus on my cousin's recovery. 2 weeks went by. The repayment date she promised came and went with no word from her. I gave it a few extra days, figuring maybe the payment she was expecting had been delayed. But after another week of silence, I called her. She answered cheerfully, like nothing was wrong, asked how I was doing. I reminded her about the repayment. She said, "Oh right, soon. Things were just a bit tight at the moment, but she'd get it to me as soon as possible." I asked how my cousin was doing, if he'd recovered okay from the surgery. She said he was doing great, back to normal, and quickly changed the subject. A month passed, still no payment, still no updates unless I initiated contact. Then I was scrolling through social media one night and saw my cousin had posted a series of photos showing off a brand new gaming setup. Top of the line everything. Custom-built PC with RGB lighting, massive curved monitor, expensive gaming chair, mechanical keyboard, the works. He was talking about how he'd finally upgraded his rig, how excited he was, tagging all the brands. I stared at those photos feeling this slow, creeping confusion turn into something darker. I called my aunt the next morning, asked her directly about the gaming setup. She got immediately defensive, her tone shifting from casual to sharp in a second. Said they needed to boost his spirits after the trauma he'd been through, that he deserved something nice after such a difficult experience. I asked which hospital he'd been in, said I wanted to send flowers or a card to thank the staff who'd taken care of him. She stammered, gave some vague name I'd never heard of, then abruptly said she had to go and hung up on me. Something wasn't adding up. The pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. So I called my cousin directly, asked him how he was feeling after the surgery, if he'd fully recovered. There was this long, confused silence on the other end. Then he asked me what surgery I was talking about. Said he hadn't been in the hospital, hadn't had any kind of accident or medical emergency. He had no idea what I was referring to. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I asked him about the $5,000. Did he know his mom had borrowed that money from me for his supposed emergency surgery? He went quiet again, then said no, he didn't know anything about that. But he did mention his mom had randomly given him money a few weeks ago and told him to treat himself to something nice. That's when he'd bought the gaming setup. My gaming setup apparently paid for with my $5,000 that was supposed to save his life. And here's where it gets absurd. I called my aunt back, and this time I wasn't asking questions. I was demanding answers. I told her I'd talked to my cousin, that I knew there was no surgery, no hospital, no emergency. I asked her directly where my money went. She tried to deflect at first, said I was being dramatic, that I'd misunderstood the situation. I told her to stop lying and tell me the truth, or I'd take legal action. She finally admitted it, said she'd been drowning in credit card debt, that she was behind on payments and facing collections, and she'd used my money to pay off her cards. The gaming setup for my cousin was meant to be a consolation, I guess, for using his fake medical crisis as the cover story. She said she'd planned to tell me eventually, that she fully intended to pay me back once she got her finances sorted out. Eventually. That magic word that means never. I told her I wanted my money back immediately, that she'd committed fraud, that she'd lied to me about a family emergency to steal $5,000. She exploded, called me selfish, said I clearly didn't understand what family meant, that family helps family in times of need. I pointed out that her time of need was fabricated from credit card debt she'd created herself, not a medical emergency. She said I was splitting hairs, that debt is debt, and I should have been willing to help her without judgment. The entitlement was breathtaking. She'd invented a dying son scenario to emotionally manipulate me into giving her money, used that money to pay off her own irresponsible spending, threw some of it at her son to buy his silence or ignorance, and now was angry at me for being upset about being defrauded. The mental gymnastics required to make herself the victim in this situation could have won Olympic gold. I told her she had 1 week to return the money, or I was reporting the fraud to the authorities and pursuing legal action. She laughed, actually laughed, and said I wouldn't do that to family. That I'd be ostracized by everyone, that they'd all see me for the heartless person I really was. Then she hung up on me again. That was her mistake, thinking I'd back down to protect her feelings or my reputation with relatives who apparently condoned fraud. I reported it, filed a police report for fraud, disputed the charge with my credit card company, provided all the text messages and call logs showing her request and promises, gave them my cousin's statement confirming he was never hospitalized. The credit card company reversed the charge within 2 weeks. My aunt found out when her account was suddenly debited $5,000 to pay back the disputed transaction. She lost her mind, called every single family member we have in common, spinning this story about how I'd reported her to the police over a simple family loan, how I'd gotten her in legal trouble, how I was tearing the family apart over money. Some relatives believed her version, called me greedy, heartless, cruel for going after my own aunt. Others stayed neutral, didn't want to get involved. A handful reached out privately to say they were proud of me for standing up to her, that she'd pulled similar manipulations on them over the years and they'd been too scared to do anything about it. She still tells anyone who'll listen that I'm a terrible person who values money over family. Conveniently leaves out the part where she invented a medical emergency to commit fraud. Conveniently forgets that I gave her the money without hesitation because I believed her lies. In her version, I'm the villain who destroyed family bonds over a few $1,000s. In reality, she destroyed her own credibility and relationships by being a liar and a thief. The thing that bothers me most isn't even the money anymore. It's the calculation behind it. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. She weaponized my love for family, my care for my cousin, my instinct to help people in crisis. She turned all of that into a tool to rob me. And when she got caught, she tried to use those same family bonds to escape consequences. That kind of manipulation doesn't happen by accident. It's practiced, refined, and I guarantee I'm not the first person she's done it to. I don't regret reporting her. I don't regret getting my money back. And I definitely don't regret cutting her out of my life completely. Real family doesn't fabricate dying relatives to steal from you. Real family doesn't gaslight you when they get caught. She taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between being related to someone and actually being family. Those two things aren't always the same. Family betrayal cuts deep, but let me tell you about the business partner who erased me from the company I helped build. I was 29 when I joined this startup, full of optimism and honestly a little naive about how the business world actually works. My boss, let's call him Dan, was 35, charismatic, had this whole visionary founder energy that made you want to believe in whatever he was selling. He pitched me on joining his company with this incredible offer, 15% equity once we officially filed the LLC, said we were building something huge together, that he needed someone with my skills to make it happen, and that we'd both be set for life if we just put in the work now. The catch was the salary, way below market rate for what I was doing, but Dan framed it as an investment in our future. He'd say things like, we're not employees, we're partners, we're building equity, not just collecting paychecks. I bought into it completely, started working 80-hour weeks, sometimes more. Nights, weekends, didn't matter. I was all in. My friends thought I was crazy. My family kept asking when I was going to get a real job with real pay. I'd tell them they didn't understand startups, that this was how you build wealth, that the equity would be worth way more than any salary. I did everything for that company: product development, client relations, operations, marketing. Wore every hat there was to wear because we were lean and scrappy, and that's what startups do, right? Dan would constantly remind me that my equity stake meant I had skin in the game, that every hour I put in was an investment in my own future. It felt good, honestly, feeling like I was building something that belonged to me, not just working to make someone else rich. After about a year of this grind, we finally landed a major client. The kind of client that validates everything, that proves the concept works, that opens doors to more opportunities. I was ecstatic. This was the moment we'd been working toward. I figured now was the time to make everything official, to finally get that equity agreement in writing and filed with the LLC. So I brought it up to Dan one day after a client meeting, asked him when we were going to finalize the paperwork. He got this look on his face, not quite uncomfortable, but not enthusiastic either, and said soon. Just soon. We're waiting for the right moment, once we have a few more things in place, once the structure is solid. I didn't push it, trusted him. We were partners after all. He wouldn't screw me over. We'd built this together. 3 months went by. The company kept growing. We were bringing in more clients, expanding operations. Everything was going well. I was still working insane hours, still getting paid below market, still believing in the promise of that 15%. Then one day I was in Dan's office dropping off some documents, and I saw a stack of legal papers on his desk. The top page had LLC filing in big letters across the header. My heart jumped. Finally, I thought. The paperwork's done. I glanced at it just casually, not trying to snoop, but it was right there in front of me. And that's when I saw it. The ownership structure. Dan's name at 100%. My name wasn't anywhere on the document. Not at 15%. Not at any percent. Not listed as a partner. Not listed as anything. I stood there staring at it, waiting for my brain to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe this was a draft. Maybe there was another document with my name on it. I picked up the papers with shaking hands and flipped through them. Dated from 2 weeks ago. Signed and notarized. Official. Legal. Final. My name appeared exactly once in the entire document, listed under employees with my below-market salary, spelled out in black and white. That's when everything clicked into place. Every conversation where he'd deflected questions about the equity, every time he'd said soon or we'll handle it later, he'd never intended to give me anything. I confronted him right there, walked into his office with the document in my hand, and asked him what this was. He barely looked up from his computer at first, then saw what I was holding and his whole demeanor shifted. Got defensive immediately. Said he'd changed the structure for legal reasons, that it made more sense for fundraising to have a single majority owner, that I'd get my equity after the next funding round. After. Always after. After the next milestone, after the next client, after the next round. The goalpost kept moving. I asked him why he didn't discuss this with me before filing. Why my supposed partner didn't think to mention he was cutting me out entirely. He got irritated, said I was being dramatic, that equity structures are complicated and I wouldn't understand the nuances, that he was protecting my interest by keeping things simple for now, protecting my interest by erasing me from the company I'd built with him for a year. The logic was breathtaking. I left his office and went straight to a lawyer that same day, explained the whole situation, showed him the texts and emails where Dan had promised equity. The lawyer looked it over and gave me the bad news. Without a written agreement, without anything signed, I had no legal claim. Verbal promises don't hold up, especially in startup equity situations. I'd worked for a year at below market salary, based on a lie I couldn't prove in court. That's when everything unraveled. I realized I'd been played. Completely. Dan had dangled equity in front of me to get cheap skilled labor, worked me to the bone, and then formalized the company structure without me, the second it became profitable enough to matter. And the worst part was, I'd let it happen. I'd trusted him, believed in the partnership, put in the work without protecting myself legally. I quit the next day, didn't give 2 weeks' notice, didn't try to work it out, just walked in and said I'm done. Dan tried to convince me to stay, suddenly very concerned about losing me now that I was leaving. Said we could work something out, that he valued my contributions. I told him he should have valued them enough to put them in writing. His company, his problem now. But here's the thing. During that year of 80-hour weeks, I'd built relationships with every single client we had. I'd been the one doing the actual work, solving their problems, being their point of contact. Those relationships were mine, not the company's. So I took every client contact I had, every relationship I'd built, and I started my own company. Did it the right way this time. Filed the LLC with my name on it. No partners, no promises, just ownership. Within 6 months, I'd landed that same major client we'd celebrated at Dan's company. They'd been working with me the whole time anyway, so when I reached out and explained I'd started my own firm, they were happy to switch. Better service, better communication, and they got to work directly with the person who actually understood their needs instead of going through Dan, who barely knew what they did. And suddenly the whole plan fell apart for him. Dan tried to sue me for theft of business opportunities, claimed I'd stolen proprietary client relationships, and violated some non-compete I'd never signed. His lawyer sent threatening letters. I sent them to my lawyer, who sent back a very polite response explaining that client relationships aren't proprietary. I'd never signed a non-compete, and good luck proving I stole anything when I was the one who'd built those relationships from scratch. We went to court anyway because Dan was that vindictive. The judge actually laughed. Not like a little chuckle, but a full-on "this is ridiculous" laugh. Asked Dan's lawyer if they seriously thought someone couldn't take their own professional relationships with them when they left a job. Asked if there was any written agreement preventing this. There wasn't. Case dismissed. Dan had to pay his own legal fees and mine. Cost him probably $50,000 to learn a lesson about putting things in writing. His company folded about a year later. Turns out when you build a business on exploiting people's trust instead of actual sustainable practices, it doesn't last. Clients left. Employees quit once they realized he'd never deliver on his promises. The major client that had validated everything went with me, and he never recovered. Last I heard, he was working for someone else now, no longer the visionary founder, just another employee collecting a paycheck. I don't feel bad about it. Not even a little. He had every opportunity to do right by me and chose not to. Sometimes the best revenge is just succeeding on your own terms, while the person who wronged you watches their empire crumble. My company's doing great now. I hire people at fair market rates with clear written agreements, no vague promises, no equity dangling, just honest work for honest pay. And when I do eventually bring on partners, their names will be on the paperwork from day one. Corporate betrayal stings, but nothing compares to the moment I realized my ex had been planning their escape the whole time I was letting them stay temporarily. My ex called me one night completely broken down, crying so hard she could barely get the words out. She'd just gone through a brutal breakup, her relationship had imploded, and she had nowhere to go. Her now ex-boyfriend had kicked her out of their shared place, and she was literally sitting in her car with a suitcase, asking if there was any way she could crash at my place for a few weeks until she figured things out. Despite our history, despite the fact that we hadn't been together in over a year, I couldn't just leave her stranded like that. I told her, yeah, of course, come over. She showed up an hour later with 2 suitcases and a backpack, mascara streaked down her face, looking completely defeated. I set her up on the couch with blankets and pillows, made her some tea, told her to take all the time she needed to get back on her feet. She thanked me probably a dozen times that first night, said she didn't know what she would have done without me, that I was saving her life. I told her it was fine, that we were adults and could handle this maturely, that a few weeks on my couch wasn't going to kill anyone. A few weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, then 3. I never brought up rent because she kept saying she was looking for jobs. Going to interviews, waiting to hear back. She'd talk about her job search over breakfast, show me listings she was applying to, seemed genuinely stressed about her finances. I figured she was doing her best and didn't want to add pressure by demanding money she clearly didn't have. Plus, she was helping around the apartment, doing dishes, keeping the place clean, so it felt like she was contributing in her own way. But something started feeling off around the 2.5-month mark. She'd get secretive phone calls she'd take in the other room. She'd be on her laptop constantly, but close it quickly whenever I walked by. She started being gone for hours at a time, with vague explanations about errands or meeting friends. I tried not to be paranoid about it, tried to respect her privacy, but the whole vibe had shifted from temporary house guest to someone actively hiding something. One afternoon, I was looking for my phone charger, thought maybe I'd left it near the couch where she'd been sitting earlier. I moved one of her bags to check underneath it, and a stack of papers slid out onto the floor. I picked them up to put them back and saw the header on the top page, lease agreement. My stomach dropped. I know I shouldn't have kept reading that it was her private documents, but I couldn't stop myself. It was a lease for a one-bedroom apartment across town. Move-in date was 3 weeks away. Only her name on it. No roommate listed. Security deposit already paid. She'd had an apartment lined up for weeks and hadn't said a single word to me about moving out. I sat there on my couch, in my apartment where she'd been living rent-free for 3 months, staring at proof that she'd been planning her exit without any intention of giving me a heads up. The lease was dated from over a month ago. She'd signed it, paid the deposit, arranged everything while still acting like she was desperately struggling and had nowhere to go. When she got home that evening, I asked her about it directly, showed her the lease papers and asked why she hadn't mentioned she was moving out. She went pale for a second, then immediately got defensive, said she'd been planning to tell me but didn't want to make things awkward, that she was going to bring it up soon. I asked her what soon meant considering her move-in date was less than a month away. She stammered something about timing and not wanting to seem ungrateful. I told her she needed to leave, that I'd been more than accommodating letting her stay rent-free for 3 months, but finding out she'd been secretly planning to move without telling me crossed a line, that if she had an apartment lined up, she could figure out somewhere else to stay for the next few weeks. She immediately started crying, said I was being cruel, that I was kicking her out with nowhere to go. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost impressive. I reminded her about the lease in my hands, the apartment she'd already paid a deposit on. She switched tactics, said that apartment wasn't ready yet, that there were issues with the previous tenant, that she needed just a few more weeks and then she'd be gone. I asked why she hadn't mentioned any of this when we talked literally that morning. She said she didn't think it was important, that she had everything under control. That's when everything unraveled. I realized she'd been using me as free housing while saving money for her new place, never intending to contribute or even communicate her plans. She'd let me believe she was broke and struggling while apparently having enough money to put down first, last, and security on a new apartment. The crying, the gratitude, the promises that she was working on getting out as soon as possible, all of it had been performance to keep me from asking questions or setting boundaries. I started packing her things right then, pulled her suitcases out of the closet, gathered her stuff from around the apartment, told her she had an hour to figure out her next move because she wasn't spending another night on my couch. She went from crying to angry, said I was being unreasonable, that friends help each other, that she couldn't believe I'd turn on her like this after everything we'd been through. Friends, that's what she called what we were doing. Friends don't lie to each other for months. Friends don't secretly plan their exit while pretending to be vulnerable and dependent. Friends communicate. What she'd done was use me, plain and simple, and now that she was caught, she wanted to make me the villain for having boundaries. She left that night, called a friend to pick her up, loaded her stuff into their car while shooting me these wounded looks like I was the worst person alive. Within 2 days, she'd told every mutual friend we had her version of the story, that she'd been going through the hardest time of her life, that I'd graciously let her stay with me, and then out of nowhere, I'd kicked her out with no warning and nowhere to go. She left out the part about the secret lease, left out the 3 months of rent-free living, left out the lies, and here's the part that still bothers me. Half of our mutual friends believed her. I'd get texts from people asking how I could be so heartless, telling me I'd really messed up, that she was devastated and I should apologize. When I'd try to explain what actually happened, show them the timeline, some of them would just say there are 2 sides to every story, or suggest that I was being petty about the details. The ones who knew me well, who'd seen my side of things before jumping to conclusions, they got it. They understood that being kind doesn't mean being a doormat, that letting someone take advantage of you for months isn't friendship. But watching people I'd known for years immediately believe I'd just randomly decided to throw someone out for no reason, that hurt in a different way than her betrayal did. She moved into her apartment exactly on schedule 3 weeks later, posted photos on social media of her new place, talking about fresh starts and cutting toxic people out of her life. The irony was completely lost on her. I was the toxic one, apparently, not the person who'd lied and manipulated for months. Looking back, I should have set clearer boundaries from the start, should have established a timeline, asked for some kind of contribution, not let things drift for 3 months without check-ins. But I also know that my mistake was being too trusting, too accommodating, too willing to help. Her mistake was being a liar. Those aren't equivalent. She still occasionally tries to paint me as the bad guy in that situation when it comes up. I've stopped trying to correct the record with people who weren't there. The friends who matter know what really happened. The ones who chose to believe her version without asking questions weren't really my friends to begin with. And she's living her life in her apartment that she could have moved into months earlier if she'd just been honest. Betrayal from an ex is one thing, but wait until you hear what my best friend did with my deepest secret. I had been best friends with Sarah for almost 8 years when I finally opened up to her about something I'd never told anyone. We were at my apartment one night, just the two of us, having one of those deep conversations that happen after midnight when your guard is down and you feel safe enough to be vulnerable. I told her about the miscarriage I'd had years ago, back when I was in a relationship that had ended badly, how I'd never fully processed it, how I still thought about it sometimes and felt this complicated mix of grief and guilt and loss that I didn't know how to handle. She hugged me, told me she was honored I trusted her with something so personal, promised she'd never tell another soul. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my best friend. We'd been through everything together. She knew things about me nobody else knew, and I'd kept her secrets just as carefully. That's what best friends do. You trust each other with the parts of yourself you can't show the world. 2 weeks later, I was at a mutual friend's party, standing in the kitchen getting a drink, when someone I barely knew came up to me with this sympathetic expression. She touched my arm gently and said she was so sorry about my loss, that she couldn't imagine how difficult it must have been, and if I ever needed to talk, she was there. I just stared at her, my brain scrambling to understand how this near stranger knew the most private thing about my life. I mumbled something like thanks and excused myself, my hands shaking as I walked away. I found Sarah in the living room laughing with a group of people, completely at ease. I pulled her aside, tried to keep my voice steady, and asked her directly if she'd told anyone about what I'd shared with her. She got this guilty look immediately. Couldn't even pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. She admitted she'd told just one person, said she needed advice on how to support me, that she wanted to make sure she was being a good friend, and didn't know how to handle something that heavy on her own. I asked who she'd told. She named someone I considered an acquaintance at best, someone known in our circle for being unable to keep anything to themselves. My stomach turned. I asked her why she didn't just ask me how I wanted to be supported, instead of broadcasting my trauma to someone who clearly couldn't keep it confidential. She started getting defensive, said she'd made a judgment call, that she was trying to help, that she didn't think it would spread. But it had spread, that one person had told others. Others had told more people. My miscarriage, this deeply personal experience I'd carried privately for years, had become party gossip. People I barely knew were offering me condolences and sympathy I never asked for, looking at me with pity, treating me like I was fragile. The privacy I'd carefully maintained around something so painful had been completely destroyed because my best friend decided her need for advice was more important than my explicit trust. I told her she'd violated my trust in the worst possible way, that I'd specifically asked her to keep it between us and she'd agreed, and then turned around and shared it anyway. She started crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from genuine remorse, but the kind that's meant to make you feel bad for being upset. She said I was making her feel terrible, that she'd only been trying to help me, that she didn't deserve to be attacked for caring. The reframing was immediate and stunning. Somehow, in the span of 5 minutes, I'd gone from the person whose trust was violated to the villain making her feel bad about it. She kept saying she'd had good intentions, that I was being too harsh, that friends make mistakes and I should be more forgiving. Not once did she actually apologize for what she'd done. Not once did she acknowledge that good intentions don't erase bad actions. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. She went to our friend group before I had a chance to process what had happened. Told them I'd attacked her at the party for trying to be supportive. Said I'd yelled at her, made a scene, and was punishing her for caring about me. By the time I started talking to people about what actually happened, half of them had already chosen their side. They'd heard her version first, the version where she was the caring friend being mistreated by the ungrateful recipient of her concern. Some friends asked for my side and understood when I explained. Others didn't want to get involved, said it was between us and they weren't picking sides, which is just a passive way of picking the side of whoever got to them first. And a few genuinely believed I was overreacting, that sharing with one person when you're worried about a friend isn't that big a deal, that I should appreciate her caring enough to seek advice. The lack of understanding was almost as painful as the original betrayal. People couldn't seem to grasp that it wasn't about her intentions, it was about consent. I'd shared something in confidence. She'd agreed to keep it confidential. Then she'd broken that agreement without asking me, and my private pain became public knowledge. The why behind her decision didn't change the what of her actions. I cut her off completely, blocked her number, unfollowed her on social media, stopped going to events where I knew she'd be. Some mutual friends thought I was being extreme. They'd say things like, "You've been friends for so long over one mistake," or "She feels really bad. Maybe you should talk to her." But they didn't get it. This wasn't one mistake. This was a fundamental violation of trust that changed how I saw her. If she could do this with something so deeply personal, what else had she shared that I didn't know about? The friend group basically split. Some people stayed close to both of us, carefully avoiding mentioning one of us to the other. Some drifted toward her because she was more social, more outgoing, easier to be around than someone nursing a betrayal. I lost friendships in the fallout, not because those people took her side necessarily, but because maintaining connections became awkward, and eventually they just faded. A year went by. I'd moved on, built new friendships, learned to be more careful about what I shared and with whom. Then one day I got a text from Sarah, long message about how she'd been thinking about our friendship, how much she missed me, asking why I was still holding a grudge over something that happened so long ago. Still holding a grudge, like I was being petty about a minor disagreement instead of protecting myself from someone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. The message was wild to me. A full year of silence, and she reached out not with an apology, not with accountability, but with confusion about why I hadn't gotten over it yet. Like there was an expiration date on betrayal, a statute of limitations on broken trust. She genuinely seemed to think enough time had passed that we should just go back to normal, that whatever she'd done wrong was ancient history, and I was being unreasonable by not moving on. I read the message 3 times, started typing a response twice, and then deleted it both times. There was nothing to say. She either understood why what she did was wrong or she didn't, and clearly she didn't. No amount of explanation from me was going to create empathy that wasn't already there. So I didn't respond, just left her on read and went about my day. She texted a few more times over the following months. Little check-ins, reminiscing about old memories, acting like we were still friends who just lost touch instead of former friends, separated by a massive betrayal. I never answered any of them. Eventually they stopped coming. I don't regret cutting her off. I don't regret refusing to engage when she reached out. Some people will violate your boundaries and then act confused when there are consequences. They'll frame their actions through their intentions and expect you to do the same. But intentions don't protect you from impact, and good intentions weaponized to avoid accountability aren't actually that good. The whole experience taught me something valuable about the difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who makes a choice. Mistakes get owned. Choices get justified. She chose to share my secret, chose who to share it with, and then chose to make herself the victim when confronted. That's not friendship. That's someone who values their own comfort over your trust. And once you see that clearly, there's no unseeing it. Trust is fragile, and nothing shattered mine faster than the moment I realized my partner's future plans didn't include me. My boyfriend and I had been together for 4 years at that point, and honestly, I thought we were solid, more than solid. We talked about marriage constantly. He'd bring it up randomly, like during dinner he'd mention what kind of wedding he wanted. Or on a weekend drive, he'd point out neighborhoods where he could see us raising kids. We toured houses together, actual houses with real estate agents and mortgage pre-approval conversations. I was planning a future with this person. I was all in. He had this habit of leaving his laptop open on the kitchen table, and I'd use it sometimes when mine was charging, or if I just needed to look something up quickly. We had that level of comfort with each other where boundaries around devices weren't really a thing. So one afternoon, I opened it to check my email and saw he'd left several tabs open. One of them was a Google Doc with a title that made my blood run cold: Exit Plan. I stared at those two words for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few seconds. Part of me wanted to close the laptop and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. I clicked on the document and started reading. It was detailed, methodical, a step-by-step breakdown of how he was going to break up with me, where he'd move after leaving our apartment, how he'd tell his family, how he'd divide our shared belongings, what he'd say to mutual friends. He'd even outlined talking points for the breakup conversation itself. The date on the document made my stomach drop even further. 6 months ago. He'd written this 6 months ago, and we'd been touring houses 3 months ago. We talked about getting engaged 2 months ago. I'd been building a future with someone who'd been planning an escape route the entire time. I felt like I'd been living in a completely different reality than he had. When he got home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop still open to the document. He walked in cheerful, started telling me about his day, then saw what was on the screen and went completely pale. Just stopped mid-sentence, frozen in the doorway. I asked him very calmly what I was looking at. He stammered something about it being old, something he'd written during a rough patch, that he'd decided to stay and forgot to delete it. I asked him why, if it was from a rough patch he'd moved past. He'd never mentioned this rough patch to me. Why I had no idea he'd been so close to leaving, that he'd created an actual exit strategy. He didn't have an answer for that, just kept saying it was complicated, that he'd work through it on his own, that it didn't matter anymore. I asked him why he never deleted it if it didn't matter. He had no answer for that either. Then I asked the question I was most afraid of. Did he still want to leave? And he said, in the quietest voice I'd ever heard from him, that he didn't know. Not that he didn't want to leave, not that he was committed to staying, that he didn't know. Like our entire relationship was just a decision he hadn't gotten around to making yet. The detachment in those 3 words hurt worse than finding the document. I realized in that moment that I'd been in a relationship with someone who'd been keeping one foot out the door for months, while I'd been diving in with both feet. While I was imagining our kids and planning which room would be the nursery, he was updating his exit strategy. The asymmetry of it was crushing. I told him I was ending it. Right there, that night, he immediately shifted into panic mode, started begging me to reconsider, saying he loved me, that we could work through this, that he just needed time to figure things out. I told him love isn't supposed to be a contingency plan, that you don't create detailed breakup strategies for relationships you're actually invested in, that I deserved someone who was all in, not someone hedging their bets while pretending to build a future with me. He spent the next few months trying to win me back. Flowers at my work, long emails about how he'd made a mistake, how he realized what he'd lost, how he wanted another chance. Texts at 2 a.m. saying he couldn't sleep without me, showing up at places he knew I'd be, trying to manufacture casual run-ins so he could talk to me. I never wavered, never responded beyond telling him to stop contacting me. Because here's the thing, once you see that someone's been planning their exit while holding your hand, you can't unsee it. But that wasn't even the worst part. About 8 months after we broke up, a mutual friend who was still in contact with him let something slip. She mentioned how it was good he'd finally stopped updating that document. I asked her what she meant. She went quiet, realized she'd said something she shouldn't have, but the damage was done. I pressed her and she admitted that he'd been updating the exit plan document the entire time we were broken up, adding notes about our breakup, adjusting his timeline, documenting his feelings. He'd been treating our entire relationship, including the breakup, like some kind of project to be managed and documented. Even when he was sending me those desperate messages about wanting me back, he was simultaneously updating his exit strategy. It was like he existed in this constant state of planning to leave while pretending to stay. The psychological whiplash of discovering that made me feel sick. I realized I'd dodged something really damaging. Not just a bad relationship, but a person who was fundamentally unable to commit, who kept escape routes mapped out as a safety net, who treated love like a spreadsheet with contingency plans and backup options. That's not partnership. That's emotional insurance fraud. Looking back now, there were signs I'd missed or explained away. The way he'd sometimes get distant for days, then snap back to being affectionate without explanation. The way he'd deflect serious conversations about timeline and commitment. The way he talked about our future in hypotheticals rather than certainties. I'd chalked it up to him being cautious or thoughtful. Turns out he was just uncommitted and too conflict averse to say it out loud. The friend who'd let it slip told me later that he'd finally deleted the document about a year after our breakup, once he started dating someone new. Part of me wondered if he'd just started a new document for the new relationship, because that level of detachment doesn't usually resolve itself. It's a pattern, a way of moving through the world where you're always planning your exit before you fully entered. I'm grateful I found that document when I did. Grateful I didn't waste more years with someone who was treating our relationship like a trial period he could terminate at any moment with a pre-written script. Some people will hold your hand while mapping out the door. The kindest thing they can do is actually walk through it instead of keeping you in relationship limbo while they decide if you're worth staying for. I'm with someone else now, someone who doesn't have exit strategies or contingency plans, someone who shows up fully instead of keeping one foot perpetually aimed at the door. And the difference is night and day. Turns out when someone's actually committed, you can feel it. There's no ambiguity, no hedged bets, no secret documents outlining how they'll leave you. Just presence, just certainty, just love without a backup plan. Planning an escape is cold, but imagine discovering your coworker framed you using your own login credentials. I was working in data entry at a mid-sized insurance company, the kind of job where accuracy is everything and mistakes can cost clients serious money. I'd been there about 2 years, had a solid track record, never missed deadlines, never had any complaints about my work. I was careful, maybe even obsessive about double-checking everything before submitting files. So when my manager called me into her office one afternoon with this grave expression on her face, I genuinely had no idea what was coming. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her computer and turned the screen toward me. Said there had been multiple reports of critical errors in client files, all coming from my account. I stared at the screen confused, scrolling through entries that showed my login credentials attached to mistakes I knew I hadn't made. Wrong policy numbers, incorrect premium calculations, mismatched client information. The kind of errors that could trigger audits or cost the company contracts. And according to the logs, I'd made over a dozen of them in the past 3 weeks. I told her immediately that something was wrong, that I hadn't made those mistakes, that I was meticulous about my work. She looked at me with this mixture of concern and skepticism, like she wanted to believe me, but the evidence was right there in black and white. She asked if anyone else had access to my account. I said no, that I was the only one who used my login. Then I stopped, remembered something from months ago. There'd been a system crash during a particularly busy day, and my coworker Sarah had needed to access some files urgently. Her computer was down and IT was swamped, so I'd given her my password temporarily, so she could log in from a different workstation and grab what she needed. I'd meant to change my password afterward, but honestly forgot about it in the chaos of that week. I told my manager about this, explained the situation, said that maybe somehow the old credentials were still active. My manager's expression shifted slightly. She said she'd look into it, but in the meantime, I was being put on a performance improvement plan. Formal documentation of the errors, weekly check-ins, the whole degrading process of being treated like I was incompetent, despite 2 years of solid work. I left her office feeling sick to my stomach, humiliated and confused about how this had happened. But that wasn't even the worst part. When I got back to my desk, Sarah came over with this concerned look on her face, asked if everything was okay with the manager meeting. I told her it was fine, just some performance stuff I was working through. She nodded sympathetically, said she hoped it all worked out, that she knew how stressful these things could be. The whole time she had this look of barely concealed satisfaction that I couldn't quite place at the time. 2 days later, my manager called me back into her office. This time, IT was there with her. They'd pulled the full access records for my account going back 3 months. And there it was. Login activity from workstations I'd never used, at times when I wasn't even in the office, accessing files I had no reason to touch. Every single one of those suspicious logins matched exactly with the timestamps of the errors that had been reported. And every single one of them came from Sarah's usual workstation. The IT guy pulled up security footage timestamps, showed Sarah sitting at her desk clearly working on something, during periods when my account was being used to create these errors. She'd been logging in as me, making deliberate mistakes in client files, logging out, and then going back to her own work. And then, after building up a pattern of errors over weeks, she'd reported me to our manager for incompetence. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Sarah and I weren't best friends, but we'd always been cordial, helped each other out when needed, grabbed coffee sometimes. I'd trusted her enough to give her my password during an emergency, and she'd kept it, saved it, and used it months later to systematically sabotage my reputation and job security. The calculation behind it was genuinely disturbing. When they confronted her about it, brought her into a meeting with HR and the IT evidence laid out, she didn't even try to deny it at first, just sat there staring at the screen with this blank expression. Then, and I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing, she claimed she was testing security protocols, said she'd noticed I hadn't changed my password after she'd used it months ago, and she was concerned about data security, so she'd logged in periodically to demonstrate the vulnerability. The HR director asked her why she'd made errors in client files if she was testing security. Sarah said she needed to create evidence of the security breach to get management's attention, asked why she'd reported me specifically instead of going to IT or HR with her concerns. She stammered something about wanting to go through proper channels. The whole explanation was so transparently absurd that even she seemed to realize mid-sentence how ridiculous it sounded. HR fired her on the spot, escorted her out of the building that same day, had her collect her personal items under supervision. I watched from my desk as she walked past carrying a box, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Part of me felt vindicated. Most of me just felt exhausted and violated. She'd tried to destroy my career for reasons I still didn't fully understand. Jealousy, maybe. Some perceived slight I was unaware of. Or maybe just because she could. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Sarah tried to sue the company for wrongful termination, claimed she was a whistleblower being punished for exposing security vulnerabilities, that the company had retaliated against her for trying to protect client data. Her lawyer sent threatening letters talking about settlements and public exposure of the company's lax security practices. For a few weeks, there was genuine concern in management that this might become a bigger issue. Then the company lawyers got involved and absolutely destroyed her case. Pulled every email, every login record, every piece of documentation showing the deliberate nature of what she'd done. Showed a clear pattern of targeted sabotage, not security testing. Demonstrated that she'd had multiple opportunities to report the password sharing through proper channels and had chosen instead to exploit it for personal gain. Her lawyer dropped the case before it even got to discovery. She'd have been laughed out of any courtroom. The company upgraded their security protocols after that, implemented mandatory password changes every 60 days, added two-factor authentication, the works. My manager apologized profusely, removed the performance improvement plan from my record, even gave me a small raise as a gesture of goodwill. But the damage to my sense of security at work had already been done. I started being paranoid about everything, triple-checking my work, looking over my shoulder constantly. The thing that really got me, though, was finding out later that I wasn't her first target. Turned out Sarah had pulled similar stunts at her previous job. Nothing quite this elaborate, but the same basic pattern of undermining coworkers to make herself look better by comparison. She'd left that job before it caught up with her, moved to our company, and eventually couldn't resist doing it again. Some people just operate that way, always looking for angles, always willing to burn others to get ahead. She still works in our industry somehow. I've seen her LinkedIn updated with a new position at a competitor firm, and every time I run into someone who mentions they work with her or are considering hiring her, I tell them exactly what happened. Not gossip, just facts. What she did, how she did it, how it ended. Some people appreciate the warning. Others think I'm being petty or holding a grudge. I don't really care which. If even one person avoids getting sabotaged because I spoke up, it's worth the awkwardness. The whole experience taught me that workplace trust is complicated and fragile, that someone can smile to your face while actively working to destroy your reputation behind your back. That documented evidence is the only thing that matters when things go sideways, and that some people will absolutely take advantage of kindness if given the opportunity. I still help coworkers when they need it, but I'm a lot more careful about how and with whom. Once burned and all that, workplace sabotage is brutal, but family manipulation runs even deeper, especially when they need your paycheck more than your happiness. I was 24 when I got the call that changed everything. A recruiter from a company I'd been dreaming about working for since college reached out about a position that was basically perfect for me. Better pay than I was making, actual career growth potential, the kind of opportunity you don't turn down. Only catch was the job was across the country, about 2,000 miles from where I'd been living my entire life. I didn't even hesitate when they made the offer. I accepted on the spot. I called my family that same night because I was genuinely excited to share the news. I thought they'd be proud, happy for me, the usual supportive family stuff. Instead, the energy on the call shifted immediately. My mum got quiet, then started asking questions in this tight voice about whether I'd really thought this through. My dad cut in saying it seemed rushed, that I should take more time to consider what I'd be leaving behind. My sister chimed in calling me selfish for just deciding to move without thinking about how it would affect everyone else. I was completely blindsided. I kept saying I'm 24, I'm an adult, this is an incredible opportunity for my career. They kept circling back to family obligations, how much they'd miss me, how I was abandoning them when they needed me. The guilt trip was heavy and confusing. I'd always been close with my family, but this reaction felt way over the top for a normal life transition that adults make all the time. Over the next few days, they ramped up the pressure. My mum called crying, saying she couldn't believe I'd choose a job over family. My dad sent long texts about loyalty and responsibility. My sister stopped responding to my messages entirely. It felt like I'd announced I was joining a cult instead of taking a job in another state. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I was being selfish, if there was something I wasn't understanding about why this was such a big deal to them. Then my brother, who'd been mostly quiet during all of this, came over to my apartment. We were talking about the whole situation, and he seemed genuinely confused about why I was surprised by their reaction. He said something like, well, yeah, they're freaking out because they need your money. I asked him what he meant. He looked at me like I was joking. Then his face changed when he realized I genuinely didn't know what he was talking about. That's when everything unraveled. For the past 2 years, I'd been giving my parents money every month. They'd framed it as me helping with bills, pitching in since I was doing well financially, and they'd helped me through college. I thought I was being a good son, contributing to the household even though I didn't live there anymore. Turns out I hadn't been helping with bills. I'd been covering part of their mortgage payment, a significant part apparently, and they'd built their entire budget around my contributions. My brother explained that they'd refinanced the house a few years back, taken on a bigger mortgage than they could really afford on their own, banking on the fact that I'd keep sending money indefinitely. They'd never told me this, never explained that my help wasn't temporary assistance but a permanent part of their financial plan. They'd just let me think I was being generous while actually depending on my income to keep their house. I felt sick, not because they needed help, but because they'd lied about it. Because instead of being honest about their situation and asking me directly if I'd be willing to commit to helping long term, they'd manipulated me into it and then acted like my life decisions were betrayals when they threatened their budget. The crying, the guilt trips, the accusations of selfishness, none of it was about missing me. It was about money. I confronted them the next day, asked them point blank if what my brother said was true. My dad got defensive immediately, said I was twisting things, that we were family and family helps each other. I asked him why they never told me I was paying part of their mortgage. My mum started crying again, said they didn't want to burden me with their financial stress, that they thought I'd be happy to help if I knew. I told them I would have been happy to help if they'd been honest, but lying to me and then guilting me for wanting to live my own life was manipulation, not family support. They admitted they needed me, that without my monthly contributions they couldn't afford the house payment, that they'd been counting on me staying local and continuing to help indefinitely. The entitlement in that admission was staggering. They'd planned my financial future without telling me, assumed I'd sacrifice my career opportunities to subsidize their lifestyle choices, and were now acting victimized that I dared to want something different. I told them I was still taking the job and moving, that I'd give them 3 months to figure out their finances, which was more than generous considering they'd been lying to me for 2 years. But after that, I was done sending money. They could refinance again, downsize, get second jobs, whatever they needed to do, but their mortgage wasn't my responsibility and never should have been without my explicit agreement. The reaction was immediate and ugly. My dad called me heartless. My mum said I was throwing them away after everything they'd done for me. My sister sent a long message about how disappointed she was, how she thought I was better than this. The irony of being called heartless by people who'd been financially manipulating me was almost funny. Almost. I moved 2 months later. They barely spoke to me during that time, except to make passive-aggressive comments about my choices or send articles about the importance of family. I sent the last payment I'd promised and then stopped. Got settled in my new city, started my new job, began building a life that was actually mine instead of one designed around their undisclosed financial needs. But that wasn't even the worst part. They nearly lost the house. Turns out my contributions had been even more critical to their budget than I'd realized. They scrambled for months trying to make the payments, falling behind, facing foreclosure. Eventually, they refinanced at a higher interest rate and significantly higher monthly payments, had to take on extra work, made a lot of sacrifices, and somehow, in their minds, all of that was my fault. We barely speak now. Occasional texts on holidays, stiff phone calls on birthdays. My mum still makes comments about how hard things have been since I left, always phrased to maximize guilt. My dad acts like I'm a stranger who happens to share his last name. My sister openly sided with them, told me I should have stayed and helped because that's what family does. Only my brother gets it, tells me privately that I did the right thing, that what they did was wrong. I have zero regrets about moving. None. My career has taken off exactly like I hoped it would. I'm making more money than I ever did before, building actual savings instead of subsidizing someone else's mortgage, living in a city I love with opportunities everywhere. Every time my family tries to guilt me about leaving, I remind myself that they had 2 years to be honest with me and chose deception instead. That's on them, not me. The whole experience taught me something crucial about the difference between helping family and being used by family. Helping is voluntary, transparent, and mutual. Being used involves lies, manipulation, and expectation without consent. My family turned my generosity into obligation without telling me, then acted betrayed when I chose my own future over their secret financial plan. That's not love, that's exploitation with a family discount. They refinanced, they survived. Their lifestyle took a hit, but they figured it out like adults do when they can't rely on someone else's income to cover their choices. And I built a life I'm genuinely proud of instead of staying trapped in a situation I never agreed to in the first place. Best decision I ever made. Family using you for money is painful, but let me tell you about the group gift where I paid everything and everyone else took the credit. My coworker's birthday was coming up, and someone in the office suggested we all chip in for a nice group gift. There were 5 of us in the immediate team, and we all got along well enough that it seemed like a good idea. Someone threw out the number $200 for a really nice gift basket, which broke down to $40 each. Totally reasonable. Everyone agreed, said they were in, and then somehow I became the person coordinating the whole thing. I asked what kind of stuff she liked, did some research, found a place that did custom gift baskets, and put together something really thoughtful. Gourmet snacks, a nice bottle of wine, some bath products, a candle, a gift card to her favorite coffee place. I spent time making sure everything fit together well, that it looked professional and generous. Paid for the whole thing up front on my credit card, figuring I'd collect from everyone after. $200 charged to my account. The day of her birthday, we had a little celebration in the break room. Cake, decorations, the usual office party setup. I brought in the gift basket and set it on the table. It looked amazing, honestly. I was proud of how it turned out. Everyone gathered around as she started opening it, and immediately my coworkers started chiming in with comments. One person said we thought you'd love this while holding up the wine bottle. Another said we picked this out together when she got to the bath products. A third made some comment about how we all contributed to make sure it was special. They were speaking in this collective we like they'd been part of the selection process, part of the planning, part of anything beyond verbally agreeing to pitch in $40 they hadn't actually given me yet. I stood there watching this happen, waiting for someone to acknowledge that I'd done all the work, that I'd paid for everything, that this was my time and effort they were currently taking credit for. Nobody did. Our coworker was thrilled, thanking everyone profusely, hugging people, saying how lucky she was to have such thoughtful teammates. The whole scene would have been really nice if it wasn't built on a complete lie. After the party wound down, I started approaching people individually to collect the $40 each. That's when the excuses started rolling in. First person said she was really tight this month, asked if she could pay me next paycheck. Second person acted confused, said he thought I was handling it. Like, handling it meant personally funding it. Third person promised she'd get me next time, which is code for never. Fourth person straight up avoided me for the rest of the day. Not a single person paid me. Not one. I'd spent $200 on a gift everyone was taking credit for, and now I was apparently just supposed to eat the cost. I gave it a few days, sent some follow-up messages, kept getting the same runaround. Always next week, always when things aren't so tight, always some version of I'll get you back that never materialized. Then she sent a group email thanking everyone for the amazing birthday gift. Went on about how thoughtful we all were, how much she appreciated having such caring coworkers, how the gift basket was exactly what she needed, that collective credit for something I'd done alone while everyone else contributed nothing but empty promises. I stared at that email for a solid 5 minutes, debating whether to let it go or say something. The polite thing would have been to let it slide, to accept that I'd been taken advantage of and move on quietly. But I was done being polite about people stealing credit and dodging responsibility. So I hit reply all, wrote a very straightforward email clarifying that I'd paid for, and assembled the entire gift basket myself, that despite everyone agreeing to contribute $40 each, I hadn't received a single payment from anyone. Thanked her for appreciating the gift and said I was glad she enjoyed it, but wanted to set the record straight about where it actually came from. Sent it before I could talk myself out of it. And here's where it gets absurd. The responses I got weren't apologies or payments or even acknowledgement that they'd screwed me over. They were accusations that I was being petty, that I was ruining a nice gesture by making it about money, that I should have just let her enjoy her birthday without creating drama. One person actually said I was acting entitled by expecting to be paid back, like collecting on a debt people explicitly agreed to was somehow unreasonable. The mental gymnastics were impressive. They'd agreed to pay, didn't pay, took credit anyway, and now I was the bad guy for pointing out the obvious. Nobody offered to pay their share even after the email. If anything, they doubled down on acting like I'd committed some social faux pas by expecting basic accountability. I stopped participating in group gifts entirely after that. Completely. Anytime someone suggested we all pitch in for something, I politely declined. When they'd ask why, I'd just say I prefer to give individual gifts if I'm going to give anything at all. Some people got the hint, others kept pushing, acting confused about why I wouldn't want to be part of the team effort anymore. The irony is they still ask me to contribute regularly. Birthdays, baby showers, retirement parties, someone's kid selling fundraiser stuff. Always the same pitch about everyone chipping in together. And I always decline, every single time. I'm polite about it, but absolutely firm. I learned my lesson about fronting money for group activities with people who have no intention of paying me back. A few months later, someone was organizing another group gift and made a comment in front of everyone about how it's too bad I don't participate anymore, that it makes things harder when not everyone contributes. I looked at her and said, that's interesting, because I contributed $200 to the last group gift and never saw a dollar from anyone else, so I figured I'd already paid my dues. The room went silent. Nobody had a response to that. They still haven't paid me back. It's been over a year now. I'm not expecting the money anymore. That $200 was the cost of learning exactly who I'm working with. People who will happily take credit for your work, dodge their commitments, and then act offended when you call them out. That's valuable information, even if it was expensive to acquire. The coworker whose birthday it was eventually found out what happened. Someone told her the full story months later. She approached me privately, apologized for the group email, said she had no idea I'd paid for everything myself, offered to pay me back the full amount. I told her it wasn't her fault, and she didn't need to do that my issue was with the people who'd committed and flaked. She paid me $50 anyway, said it was the least she could do. She's the only person who showed any accountability in that entire situation. I don't regret the reply or email. People called it petty, but sometimes being petty is just refusing to let people rewrite history in their favor. They wanted the credit without the cost, the appearance of generosity without actual sacrifice. And when I wouldn't play along with that fiction, I became the problem. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of people they are. Taking credit is one thing, but being punished for doing the right thing. That's what happened when my manager praised my ethics and then destroyed me for following policy. I was working in finance at a mid-sized firm, the kind of place where compliance and regulations weren't just suggestions, they were the foundation of everything we did. My manager, let's call him David, was constantly telling me how much he appreciated my ethical approach to work. He'd say things like, "This is why I hired you. You're so by the book, so trustworthy." It felt good, honestly, like I'd found a place where doing things the right way was actually valued. One afternoon, a long-term client called me with what seemed like a simple request. They needed a document backdated by 2 weeks to avoid a regulatory penalty. Just a small adjustment to the filing date. They said, nothing major, happens all the time. I told them politely that I couldn't do that backdating documents was a clear policy violation and could put both the client and the firm at risk. They seemed annoyed but said they understood and would handle the penalty. I thought that was the end of it. Documented the conversation in the client file, noted that they'd requested something against policy, and I'd declined, moved on with my day. Standard procedure for situations like that. We were trained specifically on how to handle these requests because they came up more often than you'd think. The company line was always the same. Politely decline, document everything, escalate if the client pushes back. 2 days later, David called me into his office and he was furious. Not disappointed, not concerned, actually angry. He closed the door harder than necessary and asked me what the hell I'd been thinking, embarrassing him in front of a major client. I had no idea what he was talking about at first. He explained that the client had called him directly to complain about my inflexibility, about how I'd refused to help them with a simple request, how I'd made them feel like criminals for asking. I explained calmly what had happened, that the client had asked me to backdate a document, and I'd refused because that's explicitly against company policy. Reminded him that he'd literally praised me last month for following procedures exactly. He waved that off, said I should have been more flexible. That policy was a guideline, not a rule. That part of client relations was finding creative solutions to their problems. The whiplash was stunning. The same person who'd built his reputation on hiring ethical employees was now telling me I should have committed fraud to keep a client happy. I told him directly that I wasn't going to backdate documents regardless of who asked, that it was a fireable offense according to our compliance training, that I could lose my license over something like that. He said I was being dramatic, that everyone does small favors for clients. That's how business works in the real world. I refused again, told him if the client wanted to resubmit the document with the correct date and pay the penalty, I'd process it immediately. But I wasn't falsifying dates. He stared at me for a long moment, then told me to get out of his office. I left feeling like I'd just stepped into an alternate dimension where up was down and following the rules was somehow wrong. 3 days later, I got written up for poor client relations, a formal reprimand in my file stating that I'd failed to provide adequate customer service, that I'd been inflexible and had damaged a key client relationship. The write-up made no mention of what the client had actually asked for, just framed it as me being difficult and uncooperative. David presented it to me with this disappointed expression, like I'd let him down, like this was my fault. I went straight to HR, brought every email I had documenting company policy on backdating documents, the compliance training materials we'd all completed, the notes from the client conversation, everything. Explained exactly what had happened and showed them the write-up that was clearly retaliatory for refusing to violate policy. The HR representative's expression changed as she read through everything, went from neutral and professional to genuinely concerned. They launched an investigation immediately, interviewed the client who apparently admitted to requesting the backdating without realizing it was a big deal. Pulled David's emails and found several instances where he'd instructed other employees to be flexible with dates or make small adjustments to help clients avoid penalties. Nothing egregious enough to be obvious fraud, but enough of a pattern to show this wasn't an isolated incident. And here's where it gets absurd. During the investigation, they discovered David had been coaching multiple employees to bend rules for certain high-value clients, framing it as good customer service while carefully avoiding putting anything too explicit in writing. He'd created this culture where following policy made you look like the problem employee, while the people willing to cut corners got praised and promoted. The whole department had been operating in this grey area, where everyone knew the rules but also knew that enforcing them too strictly would get you labeled as difficult. HR demoted him, moved him to a position with no direct reports and significantly less client contact. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone knew what had really happened, and that's when my life became absolutely miserable. He couldn't fire me, couldn't write me up anymore, but he could make every single day uncomfortable. He'd make comments in meetings about people who can't be team players. He'd exclude me from emails and then act surprised when I didn't have information I needed. He'd schedule important calls during times he knew I had conflicts. It was death by 1,000 cuts, nothing actionable enough to report, but constant enough to be exhausting. I started dreading going to work, would feel my stomach drop every time I saw an email from him, couldn't relax even on weekends because I knew Monday was coming. Other people in the department noticed but didn't say anything, probably afraid of becoming targets themselves. The whole environment became toxic. After 4 months of this, I requested a transfer to a different department, took a lateral move, same pay but completely different work, just to get away from him. HR approved it quickly, probably relieved to have a simple solution to the ongoing tension. My new manager was professional and normal, actually valued compliance, didn't play mind games. It was like being able to breathe again after months of holding my breath. David still works there, still in his demoted position, still bitter about how everything went down. And according to people who still work in that department, he tells everyone who'll listen that I threw him under the bus, that I reported him out of spite, that I cost him his career over a minor disagreement about client service. The revision of history is genuinely impressive. In his version, he's the victim of a vindictive employee, not a manager who tried to pressure someone into committing fraud and got caught. The whole experience taught me something pretty dark about workplace dynamics, that integrity can be weaponized against you, that doing the right thing doesn't always protect you from consequences, that some managers will praise your ethics right up until those ethics become inconvenient for them, and then suddenly you're the problem. I don't regret refusing to backdate that document. I don't regret reporting him to HR. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't cost me something. 4 months of psychological torture, a forced transfer, and a permanent enemy in the building. The ironic part is that if he'd just backed me up when I followed policy, none of this would have happened. The client would have paid their penalty and moved on. David would still have his position. I'd still be in that department. But he chose to punish me for doing exactly what the company trained me to do, and it blew up in his face. And somehow, in his mind, that's still my fault. Being punished for integrity is crushing, but imagine sitting down for what you think is a nice dinner, only to realize you're the target of an intervention. My family invited me to dinner at this upscale Italian place downtown, the kind of restaurant we only went to for special occasions. My mum texted saying they wanted to do something nice, that it had been too long since we all got together, and could I please make time for them. I thought maybe it was an early birthday thing, or just a family celebration. I was actually looking forward to it, took time off work, got dressed up, showed up ready for a nice evening. I walked into the restaurant and saw them already seated at a table in the back corner. All of them. My mum, my dad, both my siblings. They had these serious expressions on their faces, nobody smiling, nobody on their phones, just sitting there waiting for me with this weird energy that immediately made my stomach clench. I sat down confused, asked if everything was okay. My mum reached across the table, put her hand on mine, and said, "We need to talk. We're worried about you." An intervention. They'd orchestrated a full family intervention and disguised it as a nice dinner. I genuinely had no idea what they were about to say. I ran through possibilities in my head. Did they think I had a drinking problem? Was I secretly depressed and they'd noticed? Had someone told them something about me I didn't know they knew? My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could possibly warrant this level of coordinated concern. My mum started talking in that gentle voice people use when they're about to say something they think will hurt you. She said they'd all been talking, and they were concerned about how much I'd changed lately, that I seemed distant, that I wasn't prioritizing family the way I used to, that I was too focused on my career and losing sight of what really mattered. My dad jumped in saying they barely saw me anymore, that I always seemed too busy for them. My siblings nodded along, added their own observations about how I'd become cold and unavailable. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing, too focused on my career, not prioritizing family, distant and changing. I have a job I love that pays well and gives me stability. I visit them at least once a month, call regularly, show up for major events. I have healthy relationships, good friends, a life I've worked hard to build. And they'd ambushed me at a restaurant to tell me I was doing something wrong. I asked them what specifically they meant. What had I done that made them think I needed an intervention? My mum said I'd missed my cousin's baby shower last month. I reminded her I'd been on a work trip that had been scheduled for months, that I'd sent a gift and congratulated my cousin directly. My sister said I hadn't come to help when she moved into her new apartment. I pointed out she'd asked me with 2 days' notice on a weekday when I had a major presentation at work, and that I'd offered to help the following weekend, but she said she'd already gotten other people. Then my dad brought up the real issue. He said ever since I started setting boundaries, ever since I started saying no to things, I'd become selfish. That family is supposed to drop everything for each other, that you don't get to pick and choose when you're available. And suddenly it all clicked into place. This wasn't about me changing or being distant or prioritizing my career. This was about me learning to say no. For years, I'd been the family yes person. Someone needed help moving with 12 hours notice. I'd cancel my plans. Someone needed money. I'd send it without asking what it was for. Someone needed emotional support at 2 in the morning. I'd be on the phone for hours. I'd been trained since childhood that being a good family member meant being endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, endlessly self-sacrificing. And about 6 months ago, I'd started going to therapy and realized that dynamic was completely unhealthy. I'd started setting boundaries, not mean ones, not unreasonable ones, just basic adult boundaries. I need advance notice for commitments. I can't always drop everything for non-emergencies. I have my own life and priorities that matter too. My therapist had helped me see that saying no doesn't make you selfish. It makes you a person with limits. But my family had interpreted every boundary as a personal rejection. And here's where it gets absurd. They'd gathered together, planned this whole intervention dinner, coordinated their talking points, all because I'd started treating my own time and energy as valuable. The issue wasn't that I was struggling or in crisis or doing something harmful. The issue was that I'd stopped being convenient for them. I'd stopped being the person they could rely on to abandon her own needs for theirs. I asked them if they heard how this sounded, that they were calling me selfish for having a career I cared about, for not being available 24/7, for wanting some notice before rearranging my life. My mum got teary, said I was missing the point, that they just wanted me back. Wanted me back, like I'd gone somewhere. I was sitting right there. I just stopped letting them walk all over me. I stood up, told them I loved them, but I wasn't doing this, that if they wanted to have a real conversation about our relationship, I was happy to do that, but I wasn't going to sit through an intervention for the crime of having boundaries. My dad said if I left, I was proving their point about how I'd changed. I told him he was right. I had changed, I'd gotten healthier, and I wasn't apologizing for that. I walked out of that restaurant and sat in my car shaking, not from doubt, but from anger. The manipulation of framing a family dinner as something nice and then ambushing me with criticism. The coordinated attack disguised as concern. The complete inability to see that maybe, just maybe, their expectations were the problem, not my boundaries. It felt like emotional warfare dressed up as love. They called me immature for leaving, sent texts saying I couldn't handle criticism, that I was running away from uncomfortable conversations. My siblings got in on it too, saying I'd embarrassed them at the restaurant, that I'd made a scene. I hadn't made a scene. I'd quietly gotten up and left. But in their version of events, me refusing to sit there and accept their intervention was the real problem. I didn't speak to any of them for 3 months, ignored calls, didn't respond to texts, skipped family gatherings. It wasn't punishment, it was self-preservation. I needed space from people who thought ambushing me about my boundaries was acceptable behavior. My therapist helped me work through the guilt that came up, the voice in my head saying maybe they were right. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe I should just go back to how things were. Then came the breaking point. My mum finally sent a real message. Not a guilt trip, not a demand that I apologize, but an actual acknowledgement that maybe the intervention had been the wrong approach. She said they missed me and wanted to talk, really talk, about why things felt so strained. I agreed to meet her for coffee, just her, no ambushes. She apologized, sort of, said they'd been scared they were losing me, that the intervention came from a place of fear, not malice. I explained that they weren't losing me, but the version of me that had no boundaries wasn't coming back, that I needed them to respect that I have my own life, my own priorities, and that doesn't mean I love them less. She listened, said she'd try. We slowly started rebuilding from there. But the dynamic never fully recovered. They still resent my boundaries. I can hear it in the disappointed sighs when I say I can't make something, the passive-aggressive comments about how I'm always so busy, the comparisons to my siblings who apparently have their priorities straight. I keep the boundaries anyway because I've learned that their comfort with my lack of limits isn't worth my mental health. The whole experience taught me that some people will call you selfish for any act of self-care that inconveniences them. That family can be the hardest place to establish boundaries because they've known you longest without them, and that sometimes love looks like disappointing people who want you to stay small so they can stay comfortable. I chose myself. They're still mad about it. I'm still not sorry. Family interventions are rough, but nothing prepared me for the moment my partner's joke accidentally revealed the truth they'd been hiding. My girlfriend and I were at a party with a bunch of her friends, one of those casual weekend gatherings where everyone's drinking and the conversation gets progressively looser as the night goes on. I didn't know most of these people super well, but I got along with them fine. We were all sitting around the living room when someone brought up relationships, and the conversation turned to that half-joking, half-serious territory where people talk about compromise and expectations. One of her friends made some comment about how everyone settles at some point, that nobody really gets everything they want in a partner. A few people laughed, agreed, started sharing their own thoughts on it. Then my girlfriend chimed in. She laughed and said, "Oh, totally, like I'm clearly settling," gesturing toward me as she said it. The room erupted in laughter. I sat there completely frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard come out of her mouth. She noticed my expression immediately. The laughter was still going around the room, but her face changed, and she quickly added, "Kidding, babe," with this playful tone like it was obviously a joke and I should have known that. But I'd seen her friends exchange looks right after she said it. Quick glances between them that suggested this wasn't the first time the topic had come up, that maybe she'd said similar things before when I wasn't around. I tried to shake it off for the rest of the party, told myself it was just a joke, that people say stupid things when they're trying to be funny in group settings, that I was being too sensitive, but it sat in my chest like a stone. Every time I looked at her the rest of the night, I kept hearing those words. I'm clearly settling. The casualness with which she'd said it, the immediate laughter from her friends like they all understood exactly what she meant. On the drive home, I was quiet. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. She knew I wasn't, kept pressing, so finally I asked her if she meant what she said at the party. She looked genuinely surprised by the question, said of course not, it was just a joke. Everyone was joking about settling, so she made a joke too. I asked why her friends had looked at each other like that when she said it. She got defensive, said I was reading into things, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. I wanted to believe her. Part of me tried really hard to just accept that explanation and move on. But the comment had flipped a switch in my brain, and suddenly I was noticing things I'd either missed before or chosen to ignore. The way she'd sigh sometimes when introducing me to new people, like she was resigned to it. The way she'd bring up her exes in conversation. Not frequently, but just often enough, usually highlighting something they'd done or been that I apparently wasn't. The way she'd talk about her friends' partners with this slightly wistful tone when describing their jobs or accomplishments. Over the next few days, I couldn't let it go. Started replaying conversations in my head, looking for patterns, questioning whether I'd been blind to something obvious. Finally, I brought it up again, told her I needed to know the truth about what she'd said. She got frustrated, asked why I was still hung up on a stupid joke from a party. I told her it didn't feel like a joke, that it felt like something true that slipped out when her guard was down. Then came the breaking point. She went quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, she admitted she'd thought about it sometimes. Said she did love me, said that quickly like it was supposed to make the rest of it okay, but that sometimes she wondered if she was settling, if there was someone out there who was more ambitious, more successful, more whatever it was she thought she was missing. She framed it like it was normal, like everyone has those thoughts, and I was being unfair by making her feel bad about being honest. I asked her a question I already knew I didn't want the answer to. If someone better came along, Someone who checked all the boxes I apparently didn't? Would she stay with me? The pause before she answered told me everything I needed to know. She finally said, "I don't know," in this small voice, like admitting it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't intended. I ended it that night. Told her I wasn't interested in being someone's backup plan while they waited for an upgrade. She immediately tried to backtrack, said I was overreacting, that everyone has doubts sometimes and it didn't mean anything, that I was throwing away a good relationship over a joke and some hypothetical scenario that wasn't even real. I told her that jokes reveal truths people are afraid to say seriously, that her joke had exposed exactly how she saw me, and her inability to definitively say she'd choose me over some imaginary better option confirmed it. She didn't argue after that, didn't fight for the relationship or try to convince me I was wrong, just went quiet, packed her stuff over the next few days, and left. We haven't spoken since. No closure conversation, no final fight, no attempts to reconcile, just silence, which honestly tells me everything I needed to know about how invested she actually was. Looking back, the signs were probably there the whole time. I just didn't want to see them because I loved her and wanted to believe we were solid. But when someone tells you who they are or how they see you, you should listen, even if they're laughing when they say it, especially if they're laughing when they say it. Humor is often just honesty with plausible deniability attached. The worst part wasn't even the breakup itself. It was realizing I'd been in a relationship where I was more committed than she was, where I was building something I thought was mutual, while she was keeping her options open. That feeling of being settled for, of being good enough for now but not good enough forever, it does something to you, makes you question your worth in ways that stick around long after the relationship ends. I don't regret ending it, not for a second. Being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who sees you as a placeholder, someone who loves you but not enough, someone who's with you while passively waiting for something better to come along. That's not love, that's convenience with affection attached. Her friends probably think I overreacted. She probably tells the story as me blowing up over a harmless joke at a party. But I know what I heard in that pause when I asked if she'd stay. I know what I saw in those looks her friends exchanged. And I know that sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself is believe people when they accidentally tell you the truth. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges to the relationships that actually matter. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're officially part of the community. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one with more stories that will make you rethink everything. Sleep well, stay strong, and never let anyone convince you that protecting your peace makes you the villain. Until next time.